Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Stay at Home. I'm Bhaskar Sankara, the editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine, and I've been joined almost every day since the start of the pandemic, really, in late March, by a left-wing thinker who's been giving this kind of analysis on an issue for around 30 minutes. Then we've been doing a brief Q&A with our audience. So please do log in to YouTube, leave your questions there, press like and subscribe. That's how we reach more people. And, we should have a great discussion today. And we have a wonderful lineup this week. On Wednesday, we have from Chapo, Amber Frost, Matt Crispin, and Ben Fong, who will be doing a talk on the perils of social media and why we shouldn't confuse social media with the actual revolution, even though social media can be a tool. That's a very euphemistic, long-winded way of saying "log the fuck off," which I wasn't sure. I normally keep it pretty PG, so that's profanity here. But we're here for the children, even though we just named that Wednesday talk "log the fuck off." On Friday, we have another great talk. We have Bill Fletcher Jr. on Juneteenth and America's Incomplete Emancipation. Bill Fletcher Jr. is someone that I first met when I was a member of YDS. Maybe I was 17, 18 years old. And he's been an inspiration. He's been around on the left for a very long time. Really looking forward to that talk. And today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Gerald Horne, who's a professor at the University of Houston. He's the author of many books. I was just joking with him before the talk that he is anything but lazy. Most academics, be they left wing or not, once they get tenure, I feel like their writing drops off. But Professor Horne has maybe a new book out every 10 months or so. I just read his Paul Robeson book, which was excellent. He's the author. I'll just mention a few. Fire This Time, The What's Uprising, and the 1960s, which seems especially important and vital right now. And his latest book is called The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which is out from Monthly Review Press just now. So please definitely check out his books, pick up a copy. He'll be talking with us for around 30 minutes today. Then we're going to have a Q&A. So again, please press like, please press subscribe, and please leave your questions. But thank you so much, comrade. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day and speaking to us today.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I was instructed to try to make my remarks simple, since I should not presuppose that there's any knowledge or understanding of the subject, the 1960s. So let me apologize in advance if it's too simple, or apologize in advance if it's not simple enough, because I'm not sure where the happy medium is. So the subject is the 1960s and the urban uprisings. I'm going to focus on the topic of my book, which was introduced, which deals with the Watts Uprising in Los Angeles, California in August 1965, whereby dozens were killed, overwhelmingly Black Americans, and there were millions of dollars in damage inflicted mostly on the surrounding neighborhood, although not exclusively on the surrounding neighborhood. The ostensible trigger, and this should sound familiar, was a confrontation between a young Black man and officers of law enforcement. He was pulled over, Marquette Fry, I'm referring to, on August 11th, 1965. And what seemed to trigger the tumult that quickly erupted from what was actually a mundane incident was the rumor that was circulated that a Black woman who was in a barber smock was pregnant, and actually she wasn't, and that she had been manhandled, so to speak, by the authorities. This inflamed the surrounding community and triggered disturbances that lasted for 5 to 6 days. Now, as you might suspect, there is a lengthy backstory to the Watts Uprising of 1965. By August 1965, it's fair to say that the roots of the Black American community in Los Angeles were rather shallow. That is to say, it was mostly the product of a post-1941, post-1942 migration, generally speaking, from Louisiana and Texas. An emblem of what I'm referring to is the fact that the neighborhood in Los Angeles, once known as Little Tokyo, in 1942 quickly was renamed Bronzeville, because what was happening simultaneously was the internment of Japanese Americans from Seattle to San Diego, including Los Angeles. In fact, in one of her memoirs, Maya Angelou, the late writer, talks about how that process unfolds in San Francisco, where she was then living. And as the Japanese Americans are moved into internment camps and forced to evacuate from their residences, oftentimes flocking into these very same residences were Black Americans. This is an inauspicious beginning for a Black community amongst the West Coast of the United States. For example, the 1880 census showed that in Los Angeles, there were probably about 100 Black people. Whereas by 1741, by way of comparison, the Negroes had tried to burn down Manhattan twice, in 1712 and 1741. And so part of the story that we should keep in mind is the shallow roots of the Black community in Los Angeles. Another part of the backstory with regard to the Watts Uprising of 1965 is the Red Scare. What I mean is that there had developed in Southern California, relative to the rest of the United States, a rather strong and sturdy core of left-wingers, many of whom were communists, many of whom were in the unions that were developing at that time. For example, Los Angeles had a rather significant aerospace manufacturing industry as part of the United States fighting World War II and developing the so-called arsenal of democracy. And also with regard to the signature industry of Los Angeles, of Southern California, speaking of the film and entertainment industry, there was also a significant core of communists and left-wingers. I wrote a book about this aspect of the story. One is a biography of John Howard Lawson, happens to be a Jewish American, who was the leader of the Hollywood 10. You might recall in 1947, there was a congressional inquisition that was designed to root out so-called alleged communist influence from Hollywood. And John Howard Lawson, who had written the screenplay to Sahara, a movie you can probably find rather easily, and had written the screenplay to Algiers as well, not to mention Cry the Beloved Country, a screenplay about newly installed apartheid in South Africa, starring Sidney Poitier and Canada Lee, the former boxer who becomes an actor. Then I wrote a book called Class Struggle in Hollywood, which deals with the so-called below the line unions. That is to say, the carpenters, the painters, the set decorators, the makeup people, and how they went on strike and then they were locked out. They were routed as a result of the Red Scare, weakening unions in Hollywood, a weakening that has yet to be reversed to this very day in 2020. But for our purposes here, you should understand that the Red Scare also disrupted a so-called Communist Front, that is to say, the Civil Rights Congress, which was designed to attack police misconduct, police terror, amongst other things, amongst other issues. It was a multiracial, interracial organization driven out of business by the authorities by 1956. And as this kind of multiracial, interracial militancy is driven out of business, it creates a kind of ideological vacuum. And arising in the ideological vacuum are various forms of nationalism, to the point where by the time the Watts Uprising takes place in August 1965, the Nation of Islam was probably the organization Negroes pointed to if they were looking for a militant organization. The NAACP was also present in Los Angeles, but it had been subjected to a Red Scare also, purging its founder, W.E.B. Du Bois, in 1948 as a part of a larger process of routing and cleansing, if you like, purging a left-wing influence. And I dare say that the NAACP has yet to recover from that particular episode as well. Paul Robeson, who was mentioned in the introductory remarks introducing me, was, of course, a leader of the Civil Rights Congress. You might recall that he had filed a petition at the United Nations charging the United States authorities with genocide against Black Americans. And that was one of the reasons for his downfall. But in any case, to get closer to August 1965, despite the tumult and disruption that I've just described, the fact is that there had been a kind of progress leading up to August 1965. Recall that there was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which in many ways chipped away at US-style apartheid, making sure that a Black traveler on the road could gain access to a motel or could gain access to a restaurant. But as many have pointed out, including myself, the problem was that as you had these advances on the so-called race front, you had a retreat on the class front, because the Red Scare, as my remarks about the unions in Hollywood tended to suggest, were designed in no small measure to weaken working class organizations, particularly unions. And so you had this anomalous situation whereby the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was telling the Black people that you now have the right to eat at a restaurant, but the simultaneous attack on unions was instructing or making sure that they might not have enough money to pay the bill because they were part of an industry that might be non-union, not to mention anti-worker in general. Then, just before the Watts Uprising of 1965, you have two other signature events that were quite significant in the context in which we're discussing. You had the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is still with us today, although, as you know, it has been gutted by the John Roberts-led U.S. Supreme Court. Simultaneously, in 1965, you had immigration reform, which opened the door for further diversifying the population of the United States, helping to remove the pro-European or Eurocentric biases of immigration laws from the 1920s, opening the door to a larger Asian Pacific population in the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, I should add, and not to mention a larger Latinx population, particularly from Mexico. And then, of course, you had on the statewide level, you had the overturn of the fair housing legislation, because then, as now, you had these so-called ghettos, to use that term, and that meant that Black people were basically circumscribed in terms of where they could reside. Even today, you oftentimes hear in passing on the radio that Chicago is the most segregated city in the United States. And then you'll hear a few days later, no, St. Louis is the most segregated city in the United States. Or you'll hear Los Angeles is the most segregated city in the United States. Well, this is a dubious crown that too many cities are aspiring towards. But certainly the overturning of fair housing legislation by a vote of the California electorate was a very disturbing signal. It was a signal that there were some who were not, shall we say, committed to desegregation. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that it also paves the way for the rise of conservatism as embodied in the failed B-actor, Ronald Wilson Reagan, a former leader of the Screen Actors Guild. You'll find many references to him in my book, Class Struggle in Hollywood, because of course he moved, as so many have in the United States, from left to right, from being a so-called New Dealer to being the epitome of conservatism. And he rode the wave that was generated by the overturn of fair housing legislation in 1964, which took place at the same time that you had the Berkeley student uprisings in 1964, then followed on by the Watts uprising in 1965, and Ronald Wilson Reagan was elected governor of California in 1966, turning out the incumbent, Pat Brown, who you may recall as the father of the recently departed California governor, Edmund Jerry Brown. And this helps to inaugurate a wave of conservatism in the United States of America that reaches a kind of crescendo in 1980 when Ronald Wilson Reagan beats the peanut farmer from Georgia, Jimmy Carter, the former governor, then president from 1976 to 1980. He beats him in the presidency, then serves 2 terms, and then leaves office, turning over the mantle of power to his vice president, George H.W. Bush, and then dying subsequently and being deified, at least in certain circles. But in any case, in order to understand Watts' August 1965 and the tumult that ensued, not to mention the urban uprisings that rocked Detroit in 1967 and Newark in 1967 as well, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Newark are a kind of trifecta of civil unrest of the 1960s, although just as today you're having many demonstrations and protests concerning the tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, likewise in the 1960s you had a rippling wave of civil unrest, although it's fair to say that Los Angeles kicks this process off, and then it's followed by Detroit and Newark, and then reaches a fever pitch in April 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, which in many ways the civil unrest there in some ways mirrors the civil unrest you've witnessed in the United States since May 25th, 2020. You also need to understand the global context in order to understand what I'm discussing. The global context, to put it briefly, can be encapsulated in the year 1957, when you had simultaneously the Little Rock school desegregation crisis, where President Eisenhower was forced to send in federal troops to keep Black students from being mauled as they're seeking to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. That gave the United States, as they say, a black eye in the international community. And it came in an inopportune moment for Washington, because also in 1957, you had the independence of Ghana, West Africa, under the leadership of Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah had spent time in the United States. He attended the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He attended Lincoln University, a historically Black school outside of Philadelphia. Was very close to the Black American community. And Washington found that it might be difficult to compete for hearts and minds in independent Africa, not to mention an independent Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, which was also on the agenda, as long as people of color, particularly Black people, were treated so atrociously. And today you see echoes of that with regard to the rather stern protests that are coming out of Africa concerning the police killings that have been inflicted upon Black people in recent days and weeks. And then finally, in 1957, you had the launching of Sputnik by the former Soviet Union, which caused a kind of crisis for the US ruling class. As W.E.B. Du Bois put it, Sputnik showed that there were some in the United States who were more concerned with the race than the space race. And as a result, they were doomed to lose both. This leads to a conversation about the waste of human capital. That is to say, not allowing Black people to be educated was considered to be a waste of human capital, which leads not only to an influx of funding into land-grant universities, but to a certain extent into historically Black schools as well, like Howard University in Washington, D.C. Then in the run-up to 1965, you have the Organization of African Unity being formed in May 1963. Nationally, of course, you have the ascendancy into the White House of Lyndon Baines Johnson, the Texan, following the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963. Johnson is under tremendous pressure, which is why you have the Voting Rights Act of 64 and Voting Rights Act of 64 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965 on his agenda. Now, finally, with regard to the backdrop for Watts, you need to understand the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, which is still a thorn in the flesh of activists in Southern California. In the book, I put forth this idea of what I call draconian deterrence. Los Angeles, as you know, if you look at the topography, it's quite sprawling. The curfew zone where the unrest was centered in South Los Angeles was about 44 square miles. The curfew zone in some ways was larger than the city of San Francisco. Because Los Angeles was so sprawling, hundreds of square miles, the thesis I put forward is that the authorities felt that they had to turn every encounter, particularly with a Black American, into a brutal encounter. So the message would be sent that don't think just because there are only 7,000 police in LAPD and 30,000 in New York City, even though New York City is substantially smaller than Los Angeles, don't think you can get away with anything because we're tough guys. I should also mention as well that in terms of the impact of the Watts uprising, it leads to the formation of the Community Alert Patrol. These are young brothers and sisters who have walkie-talkies and cameras who are monitoring confrontations between Black residents and the LAPD. And that helps to give rise in 1966 to the Black Panther Party, which, depending on who you talk to, you can say it started in Oakland. My friends in New York say it actually started in New York, but the historical consensus is that it starts in Oakland and that many of the roots are in Los Angeles with the Community Alert Patrol. I should also mention that in terms of the socioeconomic landscape, you not only need to understand Jim Crow and Jim Crow in housing, that is to say, US-style apartheid, you need to understand bad schools, you need to understand deindustrialization, that is to say, as factories, auto manufacturers, tire manufacturers move out of South Los Angeles, it leaves in its wake unemployment, which becomes devastating to the Black working class in particular. And of course, this all sets the stage for 1992, when in the wake of the beating of Black motorist Rodney King being captured on tape, there's a trial of the law enforcement authorities who are not made to walk the plank. The community erupts once more. The difference with 1965 is that in 1992, you have the unrest spreading into non-Black neighborhoods, just like in the last few weeks. In Los Angeles, you've seen unrest spread into the heart of Beverly Hills. A part of the legacy, just to conclude, with regard to the Watts uprising of 1965 and all the events that I've discussed is that when you had the unrest in 1968, which I said was analogous to 2020, you had centralized organizations like the Black Panther Party, for example, but they were bludgeoned into submission in subsequent years. And I'm sure about the assassination of their leaders, such as Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, the jailing of many of their leaders, the driving into exile of many of their leaders, such as Donald Cox, who winds up in Algeria and France. And in its wake, you've had a creative adaptation in terms of Black Lives Matter, which is rather decentralized. It's kind of a leaderless protest. And I understand why that adaptation has taken place, but the question still remaining is at some point, will there be a necessity for some sort of centralized organization to better channelize the energy that's coursing through the streets so we don't have to rely so much on spontaneity, and so that we can also build the kinds of democratic structures that we will need once we take power altogether. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. Just a reminder to everyone, we've been talking to Professor Horne about the Watts uprising in 1965 and about this general history of the context for these urban rebellions in the 1960s. Please press like, press subscribe. We have a great lineup this week. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll take a look and get through them. And I'll start us off with a few questions. So one question that I have is about the contemporary response in 1965 by the CP and its organs to the uprising. So obviously, 1965, the CP is a radically weakened organization compared to what it was 15 or 20 years ago, even. And so my two questions are, one, to the extent it was still putting out communications, and I guess it was still probably called the Daily Worker at that time, and in other publications, what was the general orientation of America's Communist Party towards this revolt? And also, was the weakness or lack of presence of the CP and other communist and socialist forces in Watts and in other parts of the Black community just mostly the result of its general weakness in the face of state repression and other factors? Was there not a particular emphasis being put on organizing Black workers at the time? Where would you kind of put the burden on that question?
Well, I would say that the response of the Daily Worker and also the People's World, which was the California-based newspaper, actually based in the San Francisco Bay Area, which probably reported more on the events leading up to Watts 65 and afterwards, that was quite active. You are correct to suggest that the Communist Party had been terribly weakened by the Red Scare. That's part of the thesis of the book in question. It also had been weakened, although I must say, this is mostly in the Euro-American community. It had been weakened by the 1956 revelations about Stalin's transgressions. It had been weakened by the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. And as well, there had arisen in that same decade, as I suggest in the book, and as I suggested in my previous remarks, that once you had the rise of the Nation of Islam, which had been in existence since the early 1930s, but had its leadership jailed during World War II because of its pro-Tokyo orientation. That's discussed in my book, Facing the Rising Sun. And with the rise of the Nation of Islam, like a seesaw, as the Communist Party is being driven into the dust, you see a lot of militant Blacks who are looking for what they consider to be a militant remedy, or then driven into the ranks of the Nation of Islam. I would also say that post-August 1965, the adaptation that the Communist Party seeks to execute is to develop this idea of nationalist in form, anti-imperialist in content. That is to say, as you know, the Communist Party, like many parties, has a club or cellular structure whereby folks in a certain neighborhood or folks in a certain work site are meeting on a regular basis, trying to influence that neighborhood, trying to influence that work site. By the way, you might be interested to note that Disney probably has more communist cells in China than it has in the United States of America by several orders of magnitude. But in any case, coming out of August 1965 is development of what is called the Che Lumumba Club, which is sort of which is sort of a black club, and that continues throughout the 1960s up through the 1970s. That's the adaptation. I trust that I've answered your question. If not, please follow up.
No, I think that's a that covers a lot of it. I guess, would it be fair to draw a direct? So part of the tension of the late 60s and the mid 60s is between this rising force in the Nation of Islam that's capturing some of the militancy in the black community, but in this form. Then you still have the existing forms of trade union and other left organizing within the black community as well. Is there a direct parallel we could draw between some of the battles between Garveyism and the socialism of Randolph or the communism of other black organizers in the 30s and 40s? Is there similar dynamics at play, or is that a bit too ahistorical to draw any sort of connection there, kind of considering to draw a line to the 1960s?
No, I think there's a parallel there. For those who may not be familiar, Marcus Garvey is the Jamaican migrant who comes to the United States at the onset of World War I, circa 1915, and helps to build this mass movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which not only has branches in Harlem, which many people know, but it's probably its most vibrant branches were in the Deep South, in places like Louisiana, but also had branches in Cuba, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, the country we now know as Namibia, East Africa, for example, Kenya. And there was a kind of ideological conflict between Garveyism and, as you suggested, the socialist forces around the trade union leader, A. Philip Randolph, and organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. But I should also say that the kind of movement represented by Garveyism, in a sense, it was much more international in its nationalism. What I mean is that not only did it have these branches all over the world, in the Pan-African world, but Garveyism, if you read their newspaper, The Negro World, it paid careful and close attention to events in Paris and London. It paid close attention to events in Ireland. It paid close attention to the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, which it interpreted as a split in the pan-European world, which is not altogether inaccurate. And the nationalists that arose in the 1960s were not as internationalists as the Garveyites, perhaps because of their desiccating experience during World War II, where, as I just suggested, many were pro-Tokyo and wound up in jail. Of course, Garvey himself wound up in jail, but not because of his international positions. So yes, there are parallels with regard to these kinds of issues. Although I must say that I don't think the left has done a very good job. And this has been the subject of many of my writings over the past decade or more, of understanding settler colonialism, a term that's curiously absent from the discourse of many on the left. You never know that this was a settler colonial country. It's like being in apartheid South Africa. Nobody admits to the existence of apartheid, for example. And in my latest book on the 16th century, I do something that should have been done decades ago, which is explore the roots of pan-Europeanism in the Americas, how these Europeans who were warring, English Protestants versus Irish Catholics, English expelling the Jewish community in 1291, and then under the gun, administered by Spanish Catholics in the 1500s, they moved to pan-Europeanism and incorporate into this new identity politics that is whiteness, which then takes not only North America by storm, but a good deal of the world by storm. I find it very curious that in the US left, you have this term identity politics that oftentimes floats around, but I've never heard it applied or affixed to the identity politics of whiteness, which is one of the most toxic identity politics of all. But anyway, that's another story for another day.
Well, I guess there's a question of how we resolve this legacy of white racism, this legacy of white supremacy, right? And I guess this is where the history of socialist and communist and more broadly labor organizing has been attempting to create the multiracial organizing and the political parties and the attempts of push to capture state power, not to ignore the existence of racism and white supremacy, but instead to try to resolve it, right? And I think there's two tendencies in the left. One is to ignore it, but the other one is to just say, this is the way it's always been. This is the way it always will be. This kind of very defeatist approach to those things. So I think that, obviously nowadays in 2020, when the hope of any sort of worker state seems so distant and so far, and it seems like a lost and defeated cause, it becomes very easy to fall into this kind of pessimism about our capacity to organize and build a state by and for workers that can truly eradicate, these forms of racism and division.
Well, sure, and I think that there needs to be a bit of self-criticism as well. In some of the talks I've been giving lately, I've had occasion to speak about the foreign policy of the AFL-CIO. In my book on Southern Africa, for example, I talk about the Portuguese Revolution of 1974, which was Copernican in scope and impact, leading directly to the decolonization of Angola and Mozambique, ultimately to liberation of Zimbabwe in 1980 and the Big Enchilada of South Africa in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela. And one of the things I point out in that book is that the CIA in 1974 is ready to throw in the towel with regard to this left-leaning revolution. But the AFL-CIO leadership shows up and says, man up, this battle is not over. And then they spend all of their time trying to get the ducks in a row for the US CIA in Washington to destabilize the revolutionary movement, and they're not altogether unsuccessful. So, I mean, I think that on the one hand, we can talk about building a working class movement, but I don't think that can really be done until there's a bit of agonizing reappraisal, so to speak. Until, for example, to cite one example amongst many, you have a re-examination of AFL-CIO foreign policy, let's set domestic policy aside, which led to the propping up of right-wing anti-communist trade unions all over the world, which then allows US corporations to move their shops precisely into these anti-communist citadels abroad, thereby weakening the US working class. I mean, this is a textbook example of lunacy and idiocy. And until we have a kind of re-examination of that policy, which, by the way, has yet to be extinguished, I don't see how we can really move forward.
Well, I mean, the legacy you bring up in the 70s is truly important to remember, because, at a time when even mainstream center-left trade unions in Europe were supporting the struggle in Angola and elsewhere, a lot of U.S. unions were not. Obviously, there are exceptions, right? I think the ILWU and the electric workers. There were radical exceptions that have been anti-imperialist in the U.S. and obviously in the 80s, a segment of this wing of the labor bureaucracy, Social Democrats USA, kind of the sad legacy of the Socialist Party of America, ended up even supporting destabilization and invasion in Grenada, some leading members. So I think that history is important to remember. But it also seems to me that there has been, we should take note of progress within the labor movement today. There was that protest in DC, and we don't know who, vandalized or graffitied and broke a few windows of the AFL-CIO building. We don't know the context of that. No one claimed responsibility. There's no video of it or whatnot. But the response of the AFL-CIO, the official response at least, was a response that was far different than would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It wasn't condemning it. It was basically just saying, we could clean up graffiti, we could fix a window, but we support these protests. And obviously we could be critical. We should be of Trumka on police unions and on a host of other issues. But it seems to me that even within the trade union bureaucracy, if you want to put it this way, there is a new and more progressive element, the result of victories in the past few decades. And the old trot in me kind of wants to say, all right, to hell with them all. We just need kind of a rank and file rebellion from below. But I think we should obviously take count of some stock of that progress, right? Or am I being too optimistic?
No. I speak as a person who worked very closely with the leadership of the hospital workers in New York City in the 1980s, which is now tied to SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, which is one of the few unions in the United States that's growing. As a college professor, I was once a leader of the American Federation of Teachers Union at the college in which I was teaching. As an activist, I've written books about, I mentioned my book on Hollywood unions. I wrote a book about the National Maritime Union. I've written a book about the Caribbean labor movement, which was essential to decolonization of Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, etc. I come from a trade union family. My father was a Teamster, which used to bill itself as the largest union in the capitalist world. I grew up reading the Teamster magazine, which came to our house on a regular basis. So I stand second to none with regard to my solidarity and, in fact, membership in unions. But at the same time, let's face it. Most of the growth in unions are in the public sector. The growth in the private sector is not significant at all. And at the same time, there is a real question as to the present trajectory and orientation of unions as to whether or not it will be essential for in terms of defeating Trumpism, for example, and whether that their current orientation is necessary or is sufficiently muscular to defeat Trumpism. So that's basically what I'm talking about.
Right. So I'm getting to some of the questions from the viewers. Mercedes, I think your question was just answered. Please follow up if you didn't. If there's something to follow up on. Kenneth Vogel has a question. If you have time, Dr. Horne, were the Black Panthers weak in the U.S. South? If so, why? So a little bit, a couple years removed from your talk, because the peak of the Black Panthers kind of late 60s is really getting going. But I'm curious to hear about organizing the Black Panther Party in the South, because we think a lot when we think of the Black Panther Party about Oakland, about Chicago, about a lot of these other cities in the North. But what about the U.S. South?
Well, I would say that you had vibrant Black Panther Party chapters and affiliates in Houston, Texas. Matter of fact, somebody needs to write about their affiliate in Houston, the People's Party 2, as it was called. You had a similar strength in New Orleans, due east from Houston, and then crossing the continent into North Carolina in Winston-Salem, you had a vibrant chapter. Likewise, in Washington, D.C., which I consider to be part of the South, and in fact it is, you also had a strong and vibrant Black Panther Party chapter, although it is fair to say that it's not misguided to think of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, etc.
So, one question that I do have that you brought up, you talked about the need for organization when it comes to continuing protests. You obviously have a burst of outrage, of organic mass energy, but then there's a need to continue the struggle and deepen the struggle and radicalize the struggle, and that's why socialists, communists have always pointed to the need for institution building, for organizations of the class to carry on the struggle. Now, I guess in my mind, socialists have embraced the recent round of protest against police brutality, and they've done a very good job going out there, showing their solidarity, marching and so on. But we haven't done much of a job pushing the line that there needs to be heightened class polarization. We need to say no to corporate solidarity statements. We need to push and radicalize things, and more importantly, we need to push some sort of line that says, there needs to be the creation of these organizations and these institutions. But it's a fine line because the U.S. left is so weak and so marginalized. It is disproportionately middle class. It is disproportionately white. I mean, this is just things we can't deny about the U.S. left. So it's a bit presumptuous to say that this weak and inefficient left should be, trying to push a class line on an inspiring organic upsurge. So I guess it's not really much of a question, but I'm guessing, do you see the dilemma there? What would you say about what the role of radicals, socialists, communists, however you identify with those watching, what should be our role when something like this happens, when there's a mass upsurge against police brutality in this case, but many other injustices of the capitalist system in the future? I'm sure there will be many more.
Well, just as a footnote, since I've been writing quite a bit on the 16th century and the 17th century lately, and part of the reason I've been doing that, because I don't think it's just like if a patient goes to the doctor wants your medical history so they can make a diagnosis of what's wrong with you at that precise moment. And I did an interview with Rolling Stone a few days ago. And one of the points I pointed out was that those who consider themselves to be class warriors oftentimes don't really understand the question of class, because if they did, they would understand that one of the most profound class questions in North America historically has been the relationship between slave and slave holder. And that question has yet to be resolved altogether, which is one of the reasons why you still see people being slain in the streets. It's a legacy of that class question that's hardly ever articulated as such by those who consider themselves to be socialists. At the same time, they certainly don't look at that. And certainly with regard to settler colonialism, which in its inception involved class collaboration between an investor class of Europe sponsoring those who were trying to get away from Europe, such as Irish Catholics, for example, and then involving class collaboration to the nth degree in terms of becoming oftentimes foot soldiers for the routing of the indigenous and keeping the enslaved Africans in line, which is one of the reasons why, in terms of self-examination, self-criticism, to the extent that the left is heavily Euro-American, I mean, that has to be seen as profoundly problematic, to put it mildly, and needs to be rectified. Now, with regard to the question on the table, I would like to see folks doing what I'm trying to do, which is making sure that these international protests continue. Socialists, if they are indeed socialists, should have contacts abroad. After all, this is supposed to be an international ideology with an international movement, because historically, progress in the United States, because the United States, at least with regard to the Euro-American majority, tends to not that progressive. Some people who analyze U.S. politics don't even know that in Dixie, 9 out of 10 Euro-Americans vote for the right wing and have done so for more than a half century. In 1991, 55% in Louisiana voted for the head of the Nazi party to be governor. So until we can deal with these kinds of realities, I'm afraid to say that these socialists will be on the sideline giving advice to people who basically don't want to hear it. And so I think that there should be a bit of humility on the part of those who consider to be socialists, a bit of self-criticism and understanding why they might be on the sideline, and then trying to help the domestic movement by keeping those international fires burning.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that on the left today, though, in quarters like, let's say, the Democratic Socialists of America and other quarters, there is a tendency of white leftists to often just talk about being white leftists and to talk about those things just in very depoliticizing terms of just like, in other words, the left as it is, let's say the socialist left, you have this starting point where it's disproportionately drawn, and obviously I'm painting with a broad brush here, but disproportionately drawn from college-educated people, disproportionately white. Now the question is, though, how do you get from here to a left that better embodies the existing working class in America, that's better able to push forward the class struggle, that's better able to challenge U.S. imperialism? Well, it seems to me that there are proactive things that people can do. They could get involved with their local tenant union. They could get involved in other local struggles and communities and whatnot. So it's a balance, because I feel like people either completely ignore and want to brush aside the compositional kind of problems of this left, or its lack of rootedness, on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's people who just want to obsess over it and kind of not proactively engage in class struggle where they can, and that's the kind of balance. There is one question that I wanted to get to as well, and it comes from Paul, who asked that, you know, he's sorry, I lost the comment. I'm going to paraphrase it. He's been at recent protests lately in his city. He's seen that a lot of these protests are a majority white, or often they are, and he's trying to say that, you know, is it possible for us to draw comparisons to the rebellions of the 1960s or even the civil rights movement, given this? And what do you make of this? The racial and class composition of these protests. And Paul, if I butchered your question, please just repeat it. We'll scroll up and find it.
Well, it depends on the city. I mean, you know, Los Angeles is about 10% Black, so it wouldn't surprise me if the masses in the streets represented that demographic composition. Ditto for San Francisco. Now, if that is Atlanta, that's another story altogether. I would want to ask more questions, more probing questions about Atlanta than I would about Los Angeles.
If I could disclose our comrade's location, because he's using his real name, it should be fine. I believe Paul's in Philadelphia. He's referring.
Oh, Philadelphia. Well, even there, I would say that it would be churlish of me to say that there are too many Euro-Americans in the streets protesting against police terror against Black people. If anything, I would say there needs to be more. Having said that, if there is a real significant disproportion, if there is like 80% Euro-Americans in a city like Philadelphia and 10% Black, that should cause some red flags to be raised. I'm not saying that leads to a castigation of the movement, but it should lead to certain questions being asked about leadership, about spontaneity, etc. But in any case, once again, I would be the last person to complain about too many white folks in the streets protesting against white supremacy. I mean,
so are you a bit worried about the influx of foundation, NGO, and other corporate money? Especially because there's this organic upsurge rooted in anger at police violence and gross inequity and racism and whatever else. But there's not strong structures of leadership in place, and now there's millions and millions of dollars being poured in. Are you worried about kind of an NGOization or some other development that could be hastened by this money and the influence of at best liberal actors and occasionally corporate actors?
I've been trying to think this through, and I haven't come to any firm conclusions, but just a few data points. As I mentioned to you before we went live, the Financial Times of London had a story just a few days ago that suggested that in recent days, the corporate sectors donated about $450 million to groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Now, NAACP Legal Defense Fund is a public interest law firm. All it's going to do is file lawsuits. That's what it was set up to do. Hopefully, given the constraints of the courts, it can attain some victories, just like we had a victory today in the LBGT case, the Bostock case coming out of Georgia at the U.S. Supreme Court. With regard to other sectors, I know the historian Karen Ferguson has written about the Ford Foundation and its impact on civil rights organizing in the 1960s. I am concerned about that to a degree, but I'm trying to think this through, and perhaps some folks can help me think it through. As I see it, the anti-Trump wing of the U.S. ruling class, I think they realize that as of today, it's no guarantee that Mr. Trump will be defeated. His popularity ratings are still in the 40s. He still has significant support in Dixie. He was still, despite all these stories I read about Blue Texas, which I've been reading for years now, most likely 8 out of 10 Euro-Americans across class lines will vote for the Republicans, as they have been doing for decades now. And so as the U.S. ruling class looks for a new base, it does not surprise me that they are seeking to pour money into the Black sector, because after all, that's the most anti-Trump sector. Now, does that carry the downside of corruption? Yes. Does that carry the downside of ideological retreat? Yes. But once again, we come to the stumbling block. As long as you have this Euro-American working class coming out of settler colonialism, which feels like, in terms of this political game of musical chairs, when the music stops, Trump will make sure they have a chair. Until we can shake that, it seems to me that it's going to be very difficult, even to tell the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to turn that check back over to the Ford Foundation. I don't think that's going to work.
Right, and I think one thing that people should keep in mind is that the Democratic Party elites have, in fact, delivered nothing of any gain, of any significance, really, to any group of working people in this country. And for a lot of brown and Black voters, just defensively supporting a Democrat to prevent of someone even worse coming to power makes a lot of rational sense. But it'll be a lot easier to rebuild some sort of multiracial organizing, some sort of coalition, if it's actually behind an actual tangible program. And even when it comes to, let's say, privilege and white privilege, it's a lot easier to try to kind of carve out that a little bit and take some chunks of that out. If you could tell someone, any privilege you have is a relative privilege. It's not an absolute privilege, because if we get better funded schools, if we get decent unionized jobs, if we get all those things, you might not benefit as much as your Black neighbor, but you're still gonna benefit from this. And it's a lot easier to make that case if there's some material stakes. And it might not be that overnight you win over a majority, but I bet a actual socialist program would win over, or have the potential after few years of organizing, to win over more people than the Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden pivot to professional class voters in the suburbs and their agenda will. But Professor Horne, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for taking the hour. Thank you for joining us. And everyone else, please do press like and subscribe. That's how we get these videos out to more people. Please stay safe, continue to struggle, and we'll see you later this week on Wednesday.
Thank you. Good night.